Hello, everyone, and welcome. Yes, I I was going to talk more about some principles and sort of theory, but then I think I'll end up talking more about practice and tools because well, quite a few things have changed since I was thinking about the topic, and basically it's still not all very polished. So I want to give you some pointers on, which tool settings and kind of concepts you can use and look for when making, not necessarily designing, but making variable fonts. So in 2010, the FontLab's president, Ted Harrison, worked on an EPAR table, electronic permissions and recommendations, with a certain designer whose initial is D. And recently I've discovered that designer on type drawers, and I was wondering who that was. So I've been reading, and then, of course, because this designer has a very unique writing style, at some point I've figured out who that was. Basically, I have, when I was preparing for the talk, found myself quite a few times at a dead end with a nice view, and I'll come back to that later. So that designer is, of course, David Bellow. Oh, no, that's not David Bellow, that's Łukasz Dziedzic, sorry. This is David Bellow. And they're both doing these very complex things with axes, and basically I think these are the people who can see in multiple dimensions, like 4 or 6 or something, not just 3. So when I sometimes try to analyze and wrap my head around these topics that they tackle on, I kind of imagine them more like this. And, these multiple axes, they are very fascinating. These are sort of animations by Łukasz as sort of exploratory visualization, and he usually tries to explain to me how all this works or is supposed to work, and I'm always like, yeah, but I can't see anything here. This is too complex. So I'll try maybe to give a few alternative mental takes at the end for if you're struggling with, thinking about multiple axes. So, okay, so how do I make my fonts variable? Well, I want to give you a sort of quick tour over the different tools that are there, shipping, or available publicly, that you can use in the workflow. And I know that we're gonna, this is a very, very dynamically evolving topic, so I'm sure we're gonna see new versions and new tools at this conference announced or even available. But this is what, what I've been able to use to make variable fonts as of now. So, well, you all know the old FontLab Studio 5, and when it comes to this GVAR table and the old GX variations, FontLab Studio 5 is actually a tool that is able to open, albeit with some little confusions about the axis names, able to open existing TTFs with the GVAR table. It was, back then when Yuri implemented this, pretty much only Skia was shipping. And what he did was this code kind of tries to extrapolate the corners, so it maps the variation space into the MM space, which FontLab Studio 5 was using. So the results are not really perfect, but I found it interesting that there's been a couple of other tools that are able to do that as well. So of course there's the FontLab 6 public preview, and that too can open existing TTFs with a GVAR table, but Currently, in the current build, the axes are reverted, so this is sort of something that, this is basically a port of this old code from Studio 5, not really updated to the OpenType 1.8 specification yet. And then there's this tool that I used to make my first variable fonts when 2 years ago I was sort of helping Bernard Esfabod and Werner Lemberg to debug the free type rasterizer and sort of get this whole variable fonts thing going, because I very strongly believed that it would be fantastic, and I think I wrote on a discussion list in somewhere 2013 that maybe it would be great to resurrect MM or GX, but at that point there wasn't much interest. But then from my perspective, I was really happy to see Bernard and Werner work on this. And what they were doing, they were improving free type, which already had code to handle GX variations written by George Williams, the author of FontForge, back in 2004 or so. And FontForge actually is also able, and has been for quite some time, to open GX variation fonts and also create them with bugs and problems, because the specification at that time wasn't really clear, and the Apple TrueType spec had some sort of loose ends. So George Williams, who, I think we sort of, he's not really widely spoken of, but I think we owe a lot of gratitude to his work back then, trying to figure it out how it works, implementing it, so that the early adopters or experimenters had something to work on. So now I want to give you a couple of examples how to work your way up, so to speak, into the variable realm using different tools. So the sort of first test case that I've done is just one axis, and I've used, as an example, a spin-off of Sans Serif Pro by Frank Grieshammer, which is available under the OFL license from Adobe Type, a very, very nice text typeface. And Adobe recently has published a sort of a variable font prototype, which is based on Sans Serif Pro, and sort of comes with a little build workflow. So what I've done is I've just taken one, or actually two masters in the end. They're two UFOs. First started with the regular. And well, so these are UFOs, so you can use them, or you can edit them, create them in RoboFont, for instance, and other tools. Then, for this particular case, I've chosen FontLab 6 because that's, certain. FontLab 6, by the way, does not really support OpenType, like generating OpenType variation fonts quite yet. So, but there are some design tools that are interesting. So what I've done here is I've sort of making sure that the UFO saving preference is on. I've opened a few glyphs and turn off the exclusive editing mode, which sort of controls whether you're editing one glyph at a time or you can access multiple nodes across multiple glyphs. And the preference that was briefly shown is one that controls how FontLab 6 saves your files. It always saves the VFC file, which is sort of its own format, but along that side you can specify whether it should save some other formats, including UFO. So whenever you save, you get a UFO as well. And then I wanted to start with a sort of an ascender axis. So I just grab a few points, make the ascenders longer. And then this is, of course, not really superb design. I make these 2 points Y servant, so they sort of Interpolator long, I move these ones, the ones that I marked as Y servants follow, and then I sort of slide them to a better location, and then I sort of destroy the curve. So this is, your very quick and dirty ascender axis, of course, would require some more work. And then I've saved, so I have a bunch of sort of working files, but I have this UFO and a VFC, and indeed the two UFOs, the original one, and then the ones that I've just modified. So I have, two masters within two become ascender axes. So now, then there's Superpolator, and I want to sort of look at how to specify the design space. I know that there's going to be more talks in detail about design spaces, but I've sort of tried to figure out how it works now. So first of all, I've used a sort of a fairly recent build from, I don't know, a week ago, and because of the sort of short names for axes used to be, before variable fonts came along, used to be 2 characters, but in OpenType Variations, they're 4 characters. I've sort of customized the presets that are shipping, so replaced for ascender the previous short name with a SCN. And because it's a custom axis, I'm using all uppercase letters. So this is a recommendation basically that stems from the other conventions that are in OpenType and TrueType. So I have these presets with the tags that I've set in the prefs. So now I'm gonna add the 2 masters, the 2 UFOs, and now I need to add an axis. Well, you can do it the other way around as well. So I'm using a preset for ascender. This is one that goes from 0 to 100 with a default at 0, so it's going to be just 2 masters, one at the value of 0, one at the value of 100, and the default being the 0. So I assign the value of 100 to the other to the master I've just created, and it interpolates. So I have 1 axis, 2 masters, 0 to 100. The scale, which values to pick for this 0 and 100, that's something that will need more consideration for different kinds of axes and discussion. Some scales are reserved for the 4, I believe, currently registered axes, or maybe there are 5. Weight, width, optical size, slant, and italic. These are, I think, registered in the spec, and they have recommended scales so that users of variable fonts have sort of consistent experience regardless of which font they're using, if they're using a weight axis or width axis. Okay, so now I'm adding a few instances. So basically 1 in the middle, and then 2 for the masters. I need some instances in the workflow that I've chosen. If I didn't specify instances, even though theoretically it should be possible, but it didn't really work. There were some errors in the tools, in the tool chain. So I'm saving the Superpolator file, and then I also save or export a design space document. SP3 is a format that is sort of custom to Superpolator, and the design space is a slightly simplified format. Both are XML, and the design space is a format that is used by Superpolator and MutatorMath directly, and also the FontLab library that I'll mention later. So this is the design space document, and you see here this particular the four-letter tag. Oh yeah, ASCN, a name, the minimum maximum values, and the default. And then we have some sources, which are the masters, and they have some info like the file name, style name, family name, and also the location, which is the axis and the value at which they reside. So now I've moved these files to a master UFO subfolder. So I have the design space and the SP3, and then the two UFOs. This is just a sort of consistency naming for FontMake, an open source library that builds the fonts. Is no longer required, but I still sort of keep it because that's how it's easier to organize the project this way. And then I have a little shell script, which is if you sort of make it executable, which is a little terminal thing, and give it the extension .command, then you can double click on it and it will run. So you don't have to use terminal if you don't like it. And basically that bit is just to find this shell script needs to find the current folder. That's sort of like a copy-paste bit. And then this is sort of the relevant part, which is FontMake -m or -m, which means that we're using a design space as a source, and then the pointer to the design space file, output variable font, and use production names, meaning rename the glyphs so that they don't use the custom names that may be in the source files, but instead sort of PDF compatible names. So FontMake, well, how do I get FontMake? Well, FontMake is an open source project that is developed by a number of people at Google, but also, well, Beghdad and Esfabod and Sasha Brouwer, but also a few others, and a large number of sort of contributors. And it's a Python tool. It sort of installs a number of other libraries and heavily relies upon them. You can, if you go to GitHub, Google, I18N, internationalization /FontMake, that's the repository. In releases, you can download the version, or I have just made yesterday a sort of a repo on GitHub called Font Surgery Tools, which I try to collect all the different tools that you may find useful and just provide a simple installer for them. So you just download this little zip and then run the installer. It only works on macOS 10 now. I may try to build one for Windows. We'll see. And it will install kind of a number of different, from the fresh sources or from the release sources. There are actually two versions. There's install macOS and install macOS Devel. It's described in the docs. The Devel version will install kind of really cutting-edge versions of the tools that may not necessarily work, but this is so it will get you Homebrew, which is like a manager for command line tools if you don't have it, and then we'll install, Halfbuzz with the Halfbuzz tools, TTF AutoHint, FontMake, and a number of other things. So this is, I hope, kind of useful, and it doesn't really require using terminal at this point and going to GitHub and pulling from all the different sources. So then I ran my little batch script, shell script, and it says, cannot find base master, add info element to one of the masters in the design space document. I should have known what to do, but at this point I didn't. I figured it out later, so I'll come back to that. But FontMake and Superpolator aren't the only tools that you can use to make variable fonts. There's also Glyphs, and there are actually two different ways that you can make variable fonts using glyphs. So here's an example. I'm opening my UFOs in glyphs, and I just switch between the two fonts, so I see that they're both there. Picking one, going to font info, adding the other font as the other master. So now I have two different masters, and now the custom field is where I enter, well, a name for a custom master, but also it so happens that out of the different masters that are the name that you enter into this custom field for the last one gets used as the axis name for variable fonts. That's something that I discovered while working this. So for variable fonts, generally, this doesn't really matter so much. The axis that gets generated by default from, if you interpolate or define this custom axis, the axis tag will always be 4x's in the current Glyphs version, but the name, the visual name, the visible name, is the one that you specify in the last master in this field. But of course, what's really important is the numerical value, so I've specified 0 and 100 to sort of reflect my design space. So then I'll save this project as a Glyphs document and close the other UFO, and then I can sort of check that indeed I have the two masters and they could be used to produce a variable font. I also need instances, so I add the instances for the masters and also add an additional instance with the axis value 50 between those two. And then I can use the little preview at the bottom to either switch between the instances or show all instances for the current glyph. I noticed that the order isn't right, so I'm sort of going back in, drag and drop, and reordering the instances, then sort of switch back and forth for them to update, and they're in the right order now, so I'm sort of ready to build my variable font, and Glyphs has the export GX variation fonts format, which is marked beta. Pretty much all the other tools also deliver beta quality, so this is no surprise. I generate. I actually, because I mentioned instead of this long, I figured out, okay, this is the axis name, so I'm going to just enter something else. And as I said, this value here for the first master is 0, and for the second master is 100. When I now run font make, in this case, font make and then O variable production name's the same, but instead of -m and a pointer to a design space, I'm doing -g and a pointer to a glyphs file. It's using glyphslib and then generating a design space and UFOs and building the fonts. But using different code than Glyphs, the app. And now I'm trying, and I find something weird, and that is that it didn't generate any axes, and then it says, found two masters, one is at custom 100, and the other is also at custom 100, and therefore they didn't map to anything, and therefore it was basically FontMake built a variable font without any axes. And I was like, well, why does it do that? I wasn't sure until I was comparing some stuff, and I looked, so this is basically, I ran TTX, which is part of the font tools, which also will get installed with this tool that I mentioned before. TTX is a sort of converter from OpenType fonts to XML and back. I can use it to dump the fvar table, which is basically the table of contents of your variable font, so after opening the TTX XML, I see, okay, the FVAR table doesn't have any axes and just has some funny instances that don't really point anywhere because I don't have axis information. So I figured out that if not in glyphs, but in fact it looks like it's a sort of font make varlib something, that I had to use the value of 1 for the first master, not 0. With 0, it didn't generate an axis. With 1, it did. So what I expected, one axis going from 1 to 100, so that's all right. And the FVAR table is correct, and as I said, the axis has the, oops, okay, the axis has the four-letter code XXXX, which is probably not really good for the from the point of view of the specification, but it's all better. So now, how do I look at the font? Well, then there's Font View, which is a tool started, I think, by Sasha Braver and developed further, so part of the Google internationalization team. It runs on Mac OS X. It's a small app which I can customize the text. On the top is the variable font generated by Glyphs directly, and at the bottom is the font generated using FontMake from the Glyph source. They're slightly different because they're using different sort of code paths, and yeah, but it works. So I was very happy to discover that. And then, of course, my dear friend and colleague Lawrence Penny has made a wonderful Axis Praxis website, so I could test it there as well. And indeed, it works in both body and headline. Very nice. Okay, so I have now kind of two variants. So I have the Glyph sort of workflow and the Superpolator workflow, and I have, generally speaking, a similar structure, but the Glyphs being the sort of primary source here, and here the UFOs being a primary source. But when I use the Glyphs files, FontMake will generate sort of intermediate UFOs in the master UFO folder, which is why I also use the master UFO here as my real sources when working with Superpolator, and a design space document. And then these are the temporary TTFs that are generated, and then they're finally blended into a variable font. So yeah, so what was that thing about cannot find base master? Okay, so I realized one of the masters, if you're working with Superpolator, one of the masters, the one that you want to be the default master, the one that is seen before any variations are applied, needs this checkbox, actually the source for additional info. That needs to be checked, and only in one of the fonts, in one of the masters there in Superpolator, and that tells FontMake to use that master as the central master. So, yeah, so when I corrected that, and then seeing that I was having some other problems, because I was using these cutting-edge libraries, and so many people are working or have been working on them very intensely, so it turned out that this design space document, FontMate didn't like my design space document until I added a new element, which is described in one of the repositories by Eric from Blokland, which is new, I think, and fresh, and it's the label name, and that allows for internationalized names of the axes that are visible to the user. So basically it turns out, or it looks so, that basically this name is used as a sort of internal ID of sorts, and then the tag is what goes into the FVAR table, and the label name is what is written into the name table and associated with the axes. Okay, so it worked. I've added this little attribute there, or element, and then I got it working. Here, I didn't have a problem with the 1, so it worked with 0 to 100. I don't know why, I'm not sure what was the reason. So these are sort of I've shown you the little structure, and because the fonts are based on the OFL font, I will make this sort of little structure and hopefully some notes available on GitHub. So there will be this other repo that currently is empty. But the URL will be like so, and I'll upload my sort of experimental working font files there. Okay, so far we've seen the workflow for sort of adding, dealing with just 2 masters and 1 axis. So that's sort of the basics for you to sort of see, okay, these are the available tools, these are the sort of available methods. UFO in the end seems to be the right exchange format between the different tools, because all the tools involved can sort of read or write it. And if they can't, such as FontLab Studio 5, where you may have some old sources, for instance, VFBs or something, some time ago already we've made available as FontLab this VFB to UFO converter, which works both ways. And when it's a command line app. When you run it, download it for Mac or Windows, run it VFB to UFO, and give it a VFB, it will generate UFOs for every single master in that VFB. So effectively, if you have a 4-master VFB with 2 axes, you can turn that using VFB to UFO into 4 UFOs, and then you import them into Superpolator and sort of declare your design space there. So that's pretty much the most about the upgrading existing font projects. That's kind of what you need really. But the second part that I wanted to talk about is how the axes and master setups can differ from what you may remember about MultipleMaster. And this is sort of something that I've had some difficulty understanding, because I'm not really very good in sort of visualizing geometry. So here's another test case, right? So it's 2 axes. And this is sort of like this is Superpolator, but it's sort of like a typical, very common setup, like you would also have had in MultipleMaster fonts being developed in, let's say, FontLab Studio 5 or other tools, where you have 2 axes, in this case, the ascender going from 1 to 100, and the weight going from, 0 to 100, 0 to 1,000. And then I have 4 masters, so I can just see them there, and it's sort of, you know how it works, right? I mean, you have 4 masters, 2 axes, and it interpolates. And, the sort of short descenders, long descenders, light and bold. And that is very easy and simple, and that can be sort of directly translated into variable fonts, provided that you choose one of these masters as your neutral or default master. So if you had a design space, or let's say an setup, where you would go from, let's say, very light to very black, and then maybe also condensed to extended, then if you use a 4-master setup, without any extra work, you will need to decide that one of the corners will be your neutral master. So basically, if you had this, condensed to extended, light to black, and you pick the condensed light, that condensed light when you generate the variable font, will be the font that the user is going to see in non-variable apps and will be the default. So it will not be the sort of regular, it will not be in the middle, it will be at the corner. And if you want a different neutral masters, you basically need to slice the design space and make more corners and more masters. I think at some point tools will sort of make this happen more automatically, because you may want your variable font to come as its default appearance as the regular, but you've just designed the light and the black. So that regular, you don't want to touch it, so it's supposed to be just your interpolated regular, but you want it at the center as the neutral. Right now, as far as I understand it, using the tools today, you have to add it as a master and then set this font info, this is my default, even though you don't really need it as a master for the design process because you aren't modifying it. But it has to be there for FontMake and the other tools to sort of have this as a point of reference, because as you may have heard, the variable fonts internally, especially the TTF GVAR format, works so that, but also CFF too, I believe, not sure even, works so that you have this neutral master that is stored as the real outline, and all the other sort of masters are actually deltas, are actually movements. I'll get to that in a second, because that's what I always understood how interpolation works in like a 4-master setup. But then I thought, okay, in MM it wasn't really possible to have 3 masters, but in MutatorMath, Superpolator, which I hadn't really used before variable fonts, it was possible to do it, but I never really understood how it works. So you have this, you have these 3 masters, right? So you have one light with short ascenders, you have one bold with short ascenders, and then one light with long ascenders. So then it's all kind of quite obvious. If I move along the one axis, the ascenders, the weight grows, or if I move along the other axis, then the ascender grows, and that's all very fine. But I never really understood why this is that, where is this information coming from? Where is this master that it's sort of producing these changes? And only until I kind of explained to myself, especially with variations, it's sort of more feasible now, that if I have this central master or neutral master, which is the first one, and then I move the points or create a second master, in a way I teach the outline points how to move around. So this is, if let's have a look at this once again. So if I sort of teach this whole glyph how to make itself bolder, all the points, and then I also taught how these 4 points, where they need to go up when I'm elongating the ascenders. When I move those points up, this whole serif, along one axis, those points still know how to grow bolder in relation to each other as they did when they were below, right? There is no magic involved. It's basically, it's like, I first sort of go in this direction and then it go in this other direction. Basically, going to the other direction and along the other axis, even though the point has moved, because this information is actually also stored as a delta. That delta from, when it's bolder, move these points so-and-so by so many units, so-and-so by so many units, that doesn't change, even though in the other axis, the ascender axis, those points move, right? They move. But then when they go bolder the same way, because it's not really final outlines, or the way especially the variations work. It's not really the final outlines or masters that you're designing or that are stored. There's only one set of outlines. And then this information where the points need to go. And it's like with physics, you know, if you have different sort of forces pushing from different directions, then you have this sort of result that is a sum or whatever. Some of you maybe know. This is Łukasz explained it to me with using some graphs and explaining that it was Thales from Milet who invented all this, but I like to think of it as basically teaching my points, outline points, to move around. And then it makes sense to me. And then then I think, oh yeah, well, okay, if in this particular case, I've sort of made these isolated changes, then it's even easier to predict. And there is this wonderful font that I've seen. I don't have, unfortunately, a sample here from, I think it's Zycon, where there's this sort of hand, and every axis kind of moves kind of one finger around one outline. It's always a different portion. So basically, as long as, you know, all the sliders, each of them move sort of one bit of the outline, then you can really combine them as you want. But of course, if your changes are more radical, and basically each axis touches and moves some points, then if you combine these changes, you may get quite unexpected results. And so effectively, one thing to remember is basically it's always easier to work with the sort of full set of corners in a rectangle rather than having three, because if you have just three, then the fourth one you sort of have to predict what will happen. But if you put a master there, of course you can change it yourself. So then that's more direct information than the one that gets extrapolated. This extrapolation only works in certain cases, but in certain cases it may actually work well, because you don't need to redesign the bold and move these ascenders up if the results of the summation of these two different movements, moving up the ascenders and making bold, is fine. And maybe you only need to do the adjustments on a couple of glyphs, and in some other glyphs, that will be fine. So there are also, but yes, you need these corners. And there's this other thing that I didn't find a good sort of visualization for it the way I wanted to explain it. But here we have this thing that one of these corners needs to be this central master. If you make an intermediate master here, but this one is declared the default, and the current setup, FontMake or whatever, or the other tools won't generate valid. These will be ignored. So the masters, currently, they always need to be on an axis. And let's say if I wanted to make this my default master, I would also need to add masters here, 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 and here. So effectively, I have 4 masters, but if I wanted to move the neutral into the middle, I would suddenly have to have 9 masters. That's because the way these variation masters work, or axes, sorry, inside 0, there is this sort of internal or normalized space where instead of using these values like 1 or 500 or 100, these numbers always go from 0 to 1 and from 0 to -1. So you may have a weight axis, which internally in the normalized coordinates goes from -1 to 0 and from 0 to -1. And in fact, those two halves of the axis are sort of completely independent of each other. They're actually more like two mutually exclusive axes. You can't really have any interaction between them. You can't have intermediate tuples going across the 0. So basically, think of it, you can either set something up as going from 0 to 1, or from so 0 to 1000 or something. But if you set it up from 0 to 1 and then from 0 to -1, the other side of that axis kind of behaves almost like a separate axis. But you can't really combine the two values. But this is why when you slice the design space, if you have a rectangle, I put it in the middle, then basically I instantly get 4 rectangles out of 1. And therefore, I need these masters. Of course, I could leave out some of the corner masters, like I would leave here the 4th one, so I would only have 3. But still, it's like from 1 rectangle, you suddenly get 2 or 4 or as many, and you need masters on corners of these rectangles. So the design spaces in MutatorMath and in variation fonts, the way I understand it, they're always rectangular, so to speak. They're probably better sounding words to call it. So this is what sort of needs. I think that the tools could sort of be a bit more permissive and kind of generate these technical masters that are needed for the 0 place, and you wouldn't have to maintain them. But right now, you need to plan them in. Otherwise, you will be getting sort of unexpected results. Okay, that's all from me. So you can, if you're, first of all, if you want to try this little installer on my GitHub for all these tools, open source tools that are available, go ahead. If it doesn't work, please file an issue on GitHub and I'll try to fix it, because I know that installing all these small tools is a bit tedious, and I try to make it a bit easier for people who aren't kind of experts in pip and homebrew. And of course, you can, chat to me. If you have, I think we have maybe a couple more minutes, maybe some questions. If not, thank you very much. And so thanks a lot, and maybe some questions if you have them.
Is it working? Yeah.